Before your very eyes, Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed as crucified. When did the Galatian Christians see Jesus crucified before their very eyes? After all, they weren't there on that very first Good Friday. The answer is that they saw Jesus crucified when they heard the gospel preached. As John Bunyan, the author of The Pilgrim's Progress, puts it, Christ is set forth in the word of the gospel. And what do we see in the gospel? We see a great exchange. Christ suffers what he does not deserve, that we might be set free from the judgment we do deserve. And this is not just theory, this is personal. In the message of Christ, we encounter Christ himself. He comes to you, says Bunyan to the sinner, in the word of the gospel. Here is love, that God sent his Son, his darling, his Son that never offended, his Son that was always his delight. Here is love, that God sent him to save sinners, to save them by bearing their sins, by bearing their curse, by dying their death, and by carrying their sorrows. Here is love. When we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. While we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son. O sinful soul, the great bringer of the gospel is the Lord Jesus himself. He was and is set forth in the word of the gospel. See him making peace with God for you by his blood. See in the features of his sufferings every offer of the gospel of his grace to you. Christ is set forth as betrayed, to save the soul from being betrayed by the devil and sin. Christ is set forth as apprehended, to save the soul from being apprehended by justice. Christ is set forth as condemned, to save the soul from being condemned by the law. Christ is set forth as spat on, to save the soul from being held in contempt by the demands of holiness. Christ is set forth as scourged, to save the soul from being scourged with guilt of sins as with scorpions. Christ is set forth as buffeted, to save the soul from being continually buffeted by its own conscience. Christ is set forth as crowned with thorns, to save the soul from being crowned with dishonour and shame forever. Christ is set forth as crucified, to save the soul from dying the second death. Christ is set forth as pierced with nails and a spear, to save the soul from wounds and grief forever. Do you understand me, sinful soul? He wrestled with justice that you might have rest. He wept and mourned that you might laugh and rejoice. He was betrayed that you might go free. He was apprehended that you might escape. He was condemned that you might be justified. He was killed that you might live. He wore a crown of thorns that you might wear a crown of glory. He was nailed to the cross with his arms wide open, to show with what freeness all his merits shall be bestowed on the soul that comes to him, and how warmly he will receive it into his heart. All these benefits he offers to you freely. Yes, he comes to you in the word of the gospel, with the blood running down from his head upon his face, with his tears remaining on his cheeks, and with the holes still fresh in his hands and his feet, with the blood still flowing from his side, to ask you to accept these benefits and so to be reconciled with God.